Est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Wait.
OK, parfait. Merci.
Good morning, Francis. Well, good morning, everybody. I hope everyone liked that COVID-appropriate police song, Don't Stand Too Close to Me. Well, welcome to the Housing and Webinar series. Today's topic, and our second in the series, is Housing and Politics. My name is Piotr Borslawski, Liaison Agent for the Housing Dossier at the TQSOI, Table Quartier Sud-Ouest de l'Île. Our webinars are being held within the context of our Housing for All project, with the first objective of facilitating and empowering West Island communities to share their knowledge of current housing issues. This will facilitate brainstorming and enable residents and local stakeholders to co-create solutions for more diverse housing opportunities suitable for the West Island context. For more information, be sure to check out our website, housingforallwi.org. Now I'd like to invite Alex, Housing Dossier Coordinator at the TQS, to say a few words. Alex will be working backstage to make sure everything goes smoothly and will be moderating the chat and Q&A portion of the webinar.
Thanks, Piotr. So things look a little different on Zoom today. It's because we're using Zoom's webinar format. For those of you that weren't at our first webinar, this means that you can only see and hear the panelists and our moderator, Piotr. So unlike a regular Zoom meeting, you are not able to see yourselves and the other attendees. One of the main Zoom functions that you'll be using today as attendees is the chat, which you can access by clicking on the chat icon at the bottom of your screen. In the chat, you can type up any questions you might have that come up during the webinar. So as panelists are speaking, as Piotr is asking questions, you can go ahead and type in your questions as we go. Please note that if you'd like your questions to appear to all panelists and attendees, which we encourage, you'll have to select the all panelists and attendees in the drop-down menu in the chat. Also, feel free to ask your questions in French. So when we get to the Q&A period, I'll be reading the questions that are in the chat out loud. You'll also have the option during that period to virtually raise your hand by clicking the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen. You can then ask your question out loud yourself once we give you the chance to speak. And don't worry, we'll just go over these instructions again when we get to the Q&A period. We also encourage you all to stay with us for the length of the webinar. After the panelists close their discussion, we'll have the Q&A period, and we'll also be leaving some minutes at the end for you to fill out a short evaluation form. Finally, please note that today's webinar is being recorded.
Thanks, Alex. For decades, advocates and politicians have debated how to offer better outcomes for affordable housing on a municipal, provincial, and national agenda. Data has shown that the public sees affordability as a major problem on par with healthcare and unemployment, but there seems to be a disconnect between affordability for both owners and renters. Okay, out of curiosity, what percentage of households do you think rent in the West Island? Tell us through this pop-up poll that we got going, and we'll give everyone 30 seconds to respond. Oh, interesting. Okay, I'm going to show the results. From the 2015 census data, actually 20% of West Islanders are renters, but that's probably changed now with new developments. But vacancy rates are dropping to an all-time low, which keep housing prices high and income stagnating behind. Low-income and middle-income West Island residents who are not homeowners are struggling to keep up with the real estate industry. So what policies and strategies can be put in place to help balance this increase and the availability of affordable housing in the West Island? Well, before we dive into this topic, let me introduce our panelists. Francis Scarpaleggia was first elected Member of Parliament of Lac-Saint-Louis in 2004. He has served as the chair of the National Liberal Caucus since 2011. The Honorable Mr. Scarpaleggia is currently chair of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Environmental and Sustainable Development. He has previously served as the chair of the House of Commons Special Committee on Electoral Reform as well. Francis holds a bachelor's degree in economics at McGill University, a master's degree in economics at Columbia University, and an MBA from Concordia University. Francis's wife, Jan, have 2 daughters who are here in the West Island. Next, we have City Councillor Mr. Benoit Langevin, who describes himself as a social entrepreneur, specializing in housing social programs. Co-founder and former executive director of Action Jeunesse du West Island.What, Councillor Langevin is known for his expertise in running successful requests for government funding and program development. Recently, he has lobbied the community to build a shelter in the West Island to combat the invisible homelessness in the suburbs, an initiative known as Ricochet. He is currently City Councillor of Bois de Liesse in Pierrefonds-Roxboro Borough and member of the Social Development Commission since 2017. And then finally, last but not least, we have Simon Mamone. Simon has a background in urban planning and has worked in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. He is a development manager at the Groupe CDH, a technical resource group known as a GRT, whose mission is to share and use its expertise to carry out community housing projects across the island of Montreal. Simon has an experience in real estate development and affordable housing policy with Groupe CDH, and he strives to address relevant social political issues, particularly those of equity, heritage, and sustainable development, in order to create a positive change in the communities. Thank you all for joining us today and taking the time to discuss housing and politics. So let's dive right in. Starting with you, Simon, set the stage and tell us about social and affordable housing and what they mean, and what role does the government play in delivering these types of housing options?
I think that's a difficult task because, affordable housing has many different definitions, not only in Quebec, but across Canada, across North America, and even in Europe, it's quite different. But here in Canada, affordable housing is basically that the household needs to pay less than 30% of their income, that is before taxes, on housing. So for example, if you make minimum wage, you make about $2,000 a month, 30% of that is $600 a month. And that includes the housing costs, so the rent or the mortgage, and includes all the types of fees related to that housing, condo fees or electricity, water, and whatnot. Also, an important part of that definition of affordability is the housing needs to be adequate, meaning that if you have cockroaches, water infiltration, that's not affordable housing. That's just bad, cheap housing. Also, it needs to be adequate in the sense of space. If you're a family, you need to have enough bedrooms. We see that it's a huge problem in Montreal, overcrowding of certain apartments. That's not considered as affordable housing. So it's kind of these 3 pillars: the 30% mark, it needs to be in good condition, and it needs to be spacious enough for the household. And affordable housing is kind of an umbrella term for different types of housing. First of all, we have social housing, which is non-for-profit housing. So the private sector is not in social housing. There's 3 main types that I would call the state-owned or public housing. So this is the state or para-municipal organizations that own the housing. So Office Municipal de Montréal is one. They manage what we refer to as HLM, like the classic models of the 60s and to the 90s. And it's like more like state managed. And then we have non-for-profit housing and cooperatives. Non-for-profits housing, well, it's kind of in the name, but basically it's kind of like the traditional landlord relationship where you aren't involved in the management of your building, but you just pay rent and it's affordable rent. And then the other type is cooperative housing, where you're really implicated in the management of the building. So maintenance, you need to keep the books good, you meet with other tenants to manage the building. These 3 types of housing, so the social housing, is in Quebec financed by the program Accès-Logis. It's a great program. Basically, out of like nothing, you can create these multi-million-dollar buildings. But there's also co-investment that's offered by the CMHC, la SCHL. But co-investment is a bit better for the market housing, which is the second large category within the affordable housing umbrella. Market housing is basically, there's buildings that were meant to rent. So apartment block buildings that are popular in the West Island are one example. The other type of housing is like single family housing, condos that can be rented to other people. And then finally, we have what in Canada is super part of our identity is affordable housing, but of ownership. So it is possible to provide ownership structures where you can pay 30% or less of your income and actually own a condo, own a home. So that's pretty much a good resume,
yeah,
I think. Yeah.
Thank you. That's actually very good. Yeah, you covered everything. But you mentioned the CMHC. Francis, can you give us an update and tell us what the CMHC and the Quebec government have agreed upon when it concerns like the federal national housing strategy?
Yeah, sure. By way of background, in the 1990s, I mean, the federal government was involved in housing, building affordable housing in the 60s and 70s and 80s. But as I recollect, in the 90s, I guess in the era of major budget cutting, the federal government kind of left the jurisdiction, and everything really seems to have been at the provincial level. Well, we've brought in a national housing strategy, a federal national housing strategy, which to attach a number to it is $55 billion over a 10-year period, 2017 to 2027. Now, there's sort of two streams, if you will. On the one hand, as you mentioned, there is money that is federal money that is being channeled to the Quebec government, and in fact, the agreement for that funding was signed only very recently on October 6th, and it's funding that covers a period from April 1st, 2018, so it'll be a bit retroactive, to March 31st, 2028. The federal government is contributing $1.84 billion to the provincial government in Quebec, and of course Quebec will be adding its own. I think it's adding the same amount, so that would make for a $3.7 billion investment over 10 years. And the federal government's contribution really has three components. One is $272 million for Quebec's priorities, so it's giving $272 million to Quebec, saying to the province, you spend on your priorities. And then there's $1.1 billion essentially to the Canada Community Housing Initiative to preserve and regenerate the stock of joint social housing. So that's where sometimes both the federal government and provincial government are implicated in a housing a development. And then there's $454 million for what's called the Canada Housing Benefit, which will provide direct assistance to individuals, who need, say, it could be, I believe, up to $2,500, depending, whereby individuals will have more money in their pockets to pay rent and other housing expenditures. So that's it in a nutshell. But there's a big component that is directly funded by the federal government to projects, and all of these programs go through CMHC. It's a complicated web of programs, but that's what my office is here for, to answer any questions and to do any follow-up and research to help people access those funds if they're eligible.
Yeah, Francis, you've been in politics for as long as I've lived. You've been in...
Well, not that long.
But...
No. Well, I guess maybe if you go back to my early
tell me, what do you think has changed in the federal level when it comes to building housing? Like many of the co-ops that you're right, many of the co-ops and social housing you've seen in Montreal were actually built between 1946 and 1993. Mm-hmm. What has changed since then? What is the ideology behind all that?
Well, I think this was a major part of our 2015 platform. We basically said we pulled out, the federal government pulled out of housing really in the 1990s, and we think this is an important area of national concern. we committed to this national housing strategy. So I think the first thing to answer your question is we're back in the game.
Okay.
That's number one. And secondly, I think there's the focus. I mean, I don't remember the 80s and 70s in terms of housing policy, but my sense is that the federal government was involved in building social housing. And now the programs probably are of a greater variety. So you're looking at retrofits, shelters, new construction. Some of the CMHC programs are aimed at, they're basically all aimed at creating affordable housing, but some are aimed at working with nonprofit groups and other levels of government, like municipal government. And at least one program that I know of is really there to help for-profit developers. So, you know, I think the variety is greater. And there's another part that is kind of overlooked, which is that, you know, the federal government has surplus assets, surplus land. In fact, the hospital in Saint-Anne-de-Bellevue, you know, sort of, I wouldn't say it's surplus, but we transferred the hospital to the provincial government, and we transferred a whole lot of land around the hospital, and as a result, that will be used now for housing, which will be overseen, of course, by the city of Saint-Anne-de-Bellevue. So, but there are other, not so many. I don't know of many others in the West Island, but there are other properties around the country that the federal government doesn't need. So it's prepared to transfer these for $1 to groups that want to put these properties to good use for housing purposes.
Benoit, how do you think this will trickle down, this national housing strategy with all the billions of dollars? How do you imagine it being spent?
Or that question for me? Or
oh, no, for Benoit, sorry, for Benoit.
Yeah.
What do you think of coming down to the municipal level?
Well, my first impression, obviously, we all feel there's a lack. We know the issue. I mean, there's 28,000 people waiting for social housing right now as we speak at the OMHM. And it was like that 10 years ago when I started Ajoie as a street worker, trying to find housing for a young person in the West Island, and I couldn't find anything. And I had to go outside and go downtown to get resources. So when I hear programs at the federal level, I'm like, okay, good. But I heard about it 3 years ago, campaigning, right? I think it's absolutely necessary. The only element or the downside is that we tend to think that when the money gets to Montreal, the project is already started to be projected, which is not. So ground zero is when Montreal allows a permit and construction to start. So before Montreal can emit the permit, well, it needs to know that there's financial backing to it. And there's been a long wait, I have to say, for this amazing historical announcement that the Liberals has just made, and I was really proud of it, really happy about it. But there's downsides to it too. And we can't just blame the federal government in all of this, because I mean, the fact that our parc locatif right now, our OMHM, is in dire need of renovation. A lot of that funding will not necessarily go to new housing. And we tend to think that we're going to go like the mayor, and I'm going to go political a bit on the Plante administration, starting their mandate saying they're going to build 12,000 social and affordable housing in 4 years, new units. Let's specify that they said new units, which they will never, ever accomplish. And they're so behind what they've promised because they didn't understand how complicated the housing file is. Because as we've started talking, I mean, there's so many different models of housing. And in my case, as a representative of the district of Bois de Liesse, I'm the most privileged of all other districts or demerged cities when it comes to social housing, having the co-op Cloverdale in my district. And so that co-op brought me aware of the need and the difficulties some of our families in the West Island had to just access to those. It became a rare thing. And so, yeah, I think it's a great announcement, and I'm happy that Quebec kind of doubled it but still, like you said, there is since 1994 not much that has been built because we are having trouble to maintain the amounts of programs there is, and there's so many different models that sometimes it's really easy to get lost in. So are we really answering the need? And I can prove now, being a spokesperson of homelessness, that we're not. And there is a lot of people left behind when it comes to homelessness being so prevalent in this crisis of COVID, which exposed the fact that it's not as accessible. Another thing that my colleague Francis hasn't mentioned is the rapid housing strategy, which I think needs to be mentioned in this panel, because yes, there's a lot of stakeholders that are worried about this program not taking in consideration global approach and the accompaniment necessary for someone to keep housed, to keep them in a house in some of the clientele. But still, it's 56 million in this pandemic that has just been dropped, and really pleased about that.
Simon, what do you think? Like, the financial barrier is, I think, with the money coming down from the federal government, there's less of a financial barrier. But do you think we're too late? Is it too late, too little, too late? What do you think?
I think the federal government has done its part. Now it's really about the provincial government renewing the Accès program, because right now we're kind of in a, it's the first time in our history at Groupe CDH since the beginning of Accès that there's no units left. So for the last year, a few months, we haven't done any projects of Accès. So the provincial government needs to come up with their solution as well to how do we renew this program. That's the first thing. I think the new ICRL, like Benoit was mentioning, is a great program where we have multiple projects at Groupe CDH, but unfortunately, it kind of like doesn't work for the context of more suburban communities like the West Island for a number of reasons, and we're a bit disappointed by that. But it's just one program, and we're also exploring now because, like Francis was saying, is that the federal government is back in housing. So now we're taking a look also from our point of view, where Groupe CDH, we develop these projects with our clients. We're like getting to know the programs, this huge web of, there's plenty of things you need to consider. So we're getting a hold of this new structure, and I think it's going to take time. Yeah, we're not probably going to get the 12,000 or so units that were promised in the city of Montreal, but hopefully in the next few years it can take off. But that is really the provincial government with Accès needs to figure it out. So like that, we have two strong programs, Accès and the federal government, and this will really, really unlock the potential of developing affordable housing and social housing in the West Island.
Very interesting. Go ahead, Benoit.
Now that the city of Montreal has the rights in habitation, which la loi sur la métropole, Réflexe Montréal, Accès program used to be managed by Quebec. Now it's managed by the Habitation Service, and it's called Accès Montréal. And yes, there has been marked $150 million in the next budget for 2021, even if the entente hasn't been concluded between Montreal and Quebec as we speak today. Maybe it's signed today. But my point is that we're still not spending the money that the federal government has announced, I'd say 3 years ago. And we're talking at City Hall about the emergency, and making, I want to say, weak comparison with the fact that because the 2020, the new mixity program, will find an answer to the tents going all over Montreal. I think are weak arguments, and that needs to be called upon, because nothing of the 2020 announced will, and I'm going in the mixed city bylaw that was just passed last council, and that mixed city is not an answer to homelessness as we speak now. Nothing from that bylaw will come out until 4 or 5 years. I don't know if you can comment on that. As a CDH group, you know how long it can go from planning to funding to planning and the realization of housing. And sometimes people think that you can build a shed in a backyard and that's social housing and it's okay. It could be done in 6 months. But reality is that these types of project has so many stakeholders every single time that they take twice, maybe twice, even 3 times the amount of the private sector in time of realization.
That's a good point, because yeah, it does take time. Francis, there are deadlines to this money. Is that correct?
Well, it depends on the program. Like I know one program already is closed. It's the Affordable Housing Innovation Fund, which was a fund, and these things open and close. It depends on funding. It depends on the upcoming budget. But that program was to encourage new funding models and innovative building techniques in the affordable housing sector. But in terms of other programs, I don't have the deadline dates per se, but I guess what I'm saying is, and to everyone's point, is that housing is extremely complex. It's not just a question of, knocking on a door. You need to bring people together, develop the project, the concept. And my office is there. If somebody has an idea, I know that I've been in touch with members of Ajwa over the Ricochet project to invite them to roundtables to learn more about what's available. And we're there, if somebody has a question, to say, look, I have this idea, I've got some partners potentially, I've identified a space, how can the federal government help? Then we start digging. We have our contacts at CMHC and so on. So we can explore eligibility requirements, deadlines, and so on and so forth. So I invite anyone who, and again, right now I'm quite focused on Ricochet because that's something that's taking shape, and we believe that 1 or 2 of these programs might be able to help. So that's, I'm encouraging anyone who has a concrete idea and some potential partners to approach my office, and we'll do some research.
You're definitely right, Francis, that it's very complex. But there are a lot of tools, like a mechanic who sees a problem with a car, he has different tools that he can solve and fix the problem, right?
Right.
One of those tools is the inclusionary zoning strategy that Benoit has mentioned. And it is a tool that will boost affordability. It won't eliminate it, but it'll definitely boost it. Simon, can you give us a bit more information about how that will look, an inclusionary strategy that's mandatory at this point?
Well, it's interesting that it's going to be mandatory, but only for the city of Montreal, right? So the agglomeration, so certain municipalities that are independent won't have that. So my first fear is right away, I already see that there's going to be development pressure going towards these communities where there's not going to be inclusionary zoning in place, like the Métropole Mix. This is my first fear. But for example, Pierrefonds-Roxboro was part of the city. So I think it's going to be definitely a plus. For us, we work with the private sector to provide kind of that segment of affordable housing. We have a program for that. And we collaborate right now on some of the Montreal's biggest sites with developers on the Métropole Mix to ensure that there's social housing included in large developments. So you guys know probably the Molson development near downtown, working on that. And in the West Island, we're seeing big properties as well. Like Fairview of Point Claire is going to be a big one. And right now there's no regulation in place to regulate the amount of social or affordable housing that's going to be there. So I think it's going to be for us personally, it's been a really good because developers want to talk to us to see how we can collaborate to provide a more diversity of housing, not just very expensive condos, but very like mixed communities. So that's interesting. That's what the new regulation has brought to us. But now it's just a question to see what's going to be the response for the other municipalities that don't have this regulation. I'm curious to see what's going to happen.
Yeah, you're right. It's a simple tool. It's a bylaw. It's a bylaw that's this Montreal has put in place. But Ben, I'm going to ask you this before you can follow up as well. Are we too easy on developers? There are a lot of things going on in that bylaw that have not say loopholes, but there are different strategies to go through it. What do you think?
I think bylaws are never perfect, and especially that one.
That's true.
And especially that one. And I think there's a time limit as the market evolves and as the stakeholders evolve as well, who investors change over the years in Montreal. There's many aspects to this that, can you hear me? I was
yeah, we're good. Yeah, we're
receiving
good.
a call at the
yeah.
same time. And I think that, yes, one of the main problem with this bylaw is that there's 19 boroughs, yet there's 15 demerged cities, and we're part of the CMM, which includes Vaudreuil, Les Cèdres, which includes Laval, which includes all these big municipalities. And I find it a bit odd that we're willing to go, and I voted against last week that bylaw, and especially even if I've been an advocate for homelessness over all these years, is because at the end of the day, it's going to be the first buyers that's going to pay a hidden tax. Because when you think that a project will have, on top of the REM taxation, will have a housing taxation, quote unquote, if they decide to build, versus paying the square meter price it costs to the city, and then they can rebuild something else, somewhere else. Bottom line is that I believe, not only did I believe, but I joined the party that gave all the rights of doing this bylaw to the city of Montreal with the Réflexe Montréal. And now we have the Plante administration arriving with a bylaw without all the other CMM players, which would include Kirkland, Pointe Claire. And so I find it sad that for a place like Pierrefonds-Roxboro, which, you know, it's a long banana and it's 1/3 of the island in distance. So when you think of geographically, the urbaning planning, obviously DDO will have an advantage over us when it comes to the REM station, for instance. So I'm kind of worried that at the end of the day, Montrealers in Montreal, well, the first people buying a house will have to pay more. And by having to pay more, it brings all the other elements around it more expensive. When you develop housing that is more expensive, well, around it, rent will go higher as well. So it has a ripple effect on the fact that when you have housing accessibility and rental housing, everything is connected. It becomes a market. And we can't think that Montreal is one element out of an economical, it's an ecosystem. And so that bylaw has been denounced by the OCPM, which is the OCPM is the body that does the public consultation that is independent, completely apolitical. And 2/3 of that bylaw has been criticized by them. And out of all the recommendation, nothing has been adapted. The major elements aren't there. And so if 2/3 of your regulation is criticized by the OCPM, why aren't you not waiting, but adapting it to what the experts are saying? And also the fact that, as my colleague was saying from the City Ash, is that think about the fact that now the private sector is calling groups to see how they can have more social housing. I think that it's a good thing. And I think that it's not a black or white thing, but right now, the way that bylaw is presented and the way, I think it's a draft. I think there needs to have improvement, because when you think of, let's say, the high rise, the more you want high rise, the more it's going to be expensive, or the percentage of affordable housing you're going to have to put will be higher. So how do you encourage hubs where there's concentration? We want to densify. Sure, we want to stop urban sprawl for the climate crisis that we've been talking about. You know, that bylaw makes it more interesting to go elsewhere than Montreal. So you have to really, really go deep in that bylaw to understand that it's supposed to make it more accessible for families, but yet it's a small percentage of families that will have access, and the ones that are going to pay for that small percentage of families that are going to have access to social housing is small families as well, in another bracket of the population, which is la classe moyenne. So you're telling the classe moyenne to pay for social housing, not the private investors, because at the end of the day, they're paying.
Okay, Benoit, then what is an alternative to boost affordable housing? What do you think?
To boost affordable housing, I think that this bylaw has to progress, and it has to progress with the private investors, with the investors. It cannot be just done and say that it does things without implicating all the major players. We're in a pandemic right now, and this bylaw arrives and it just adds another layer of taxation to the classe moyenne. It's not a good timing. So when you I can criticize, but to offer something more to this bylaw, I think the first thing is to have a mayor that's capable of convincing her colleagues at the CMM that they all need an inclusivity bylaw. The mayor keeps on saying, oh yeah, some of them are coming, but no one is really saying, well, yes, in Terrebonne, we're going to put an inclusivity bylaw that will not affect Montreal's market. We're not living in a bubble, and unfortunately, I think that as well as Demerge City needs one, I think that every single city should have an inclusivity bylaw, because, and like we said earlier, it's just one tool, but all of them should have it, because it should be done also with the investors that are presenting projects at any city. And it should be done in collaboration. It shouldn't be an imposed hidden taxation that at the end of the day becomes something that the classe moyenne has to pay.
Simon, what do you think? Should we? So yeah, go ahead. So I was going to ask you, what do you think about?
I was just going to say, maybe to add was what Benoit was saying, some of the things we like, because Groupe works like everywhere on the island. And at the municipal level, what's interesting is, I'll take an example in Montreal North. They have, like, in their zoning bylaw, they have specifically parking standards just for social housing. And then they define social housing. So the parking requirements are less. Or for example, certain uses are allowed for social housing. So in commercial areas, residential is allowed. Or for example, same thing, we can do the same thing with the height. So instead of a private developer going to 3, well, if Groupe CDH with a community group develops the site, then we can go up to 5. So you see where it creates this incentive where, I can buy a piece of land for like cheaper or the same price and be competitive against the private market, the condo builders. In this way, I can develop way faster, way cheaper, and it's a win-win situation where the landowner sells at a really good price and I get a good deal. Or the community gets a good deal. And there's plenty of other things as well. I think Francis also mentioned that the federal government is a big landowner. Well, municipalities are insane landowners, especially in the West Island where they have a lot of land. We've built a lot of civic centers that are super not densified. We build pools of 1-2 story high, arenas of 1-2 story highs, but libraries that are very low. Why don't cities sell the airspace on top of these buildings? We can definitely create big hubs this way for cheap ways, and municipalities can use that funding to develop infrastructure like pools, arenas, whatever, and at the same time provide housing for the community. This is something that's been more happening in BC, but I think it hasn't been really proposed. Same things with schools. We have massive schools in the West Island that are not dense at all. We've seen here in Montreal, first example of housing on top of a school, which is really beneficial for children, for families, and also the commission scolaire that get to also get money from this development. So it's like finding these win-win situations for everyone, I think, is key, and that can be done through zoning regulations.
Well, definitely, you're definitely right.
Sorry, just briefly.
Go ahead, Francis. Yeah.
That generates the kinds of partnerships that are required in a lot of these programs, MHP programs.
But we have to talk about the elephant in the room, the REM stations that are going across the West Island. These are big projects proposed by big developers. We're talking billion-dollar companies. Cadillac Riverview isn't a local developer. It's a multinational developer. We have North American Group in Dorval. That's a multinational group as well. Devimco. Francis, if you were going to give mayors one piece of advice on dealing with big corporations, what would you do? What would you give them, in the sense that, should they be afraid of them? Should they be, what advice would you give mayors?
Well, you know, one of the things about housing is because of the bylaw aspect, and because a lot of housing has the involvement of municipalities, municipal politicians are really have a lot of depth on this issue. And I look at Benoit, and he reminds me of another member of our caucus from Toronto, Adam Vaughan, who's the parliamentary secretary for housing. He came out of the municipal ecosystem. He knows everything you need to know about housing, and he's a great resource, and I can call on him anytime. But so I think a lot of it has to do, it seems to me, a lot of it has to do with what you can do with bylaws without unduly expropriating. And we've seen groups use municipal rules and regulations to influence landowners. We saw it in Angel Woods. I mean, that was not, as they say in French, "c'est pas évident au départ." These landowners had rights, and somehow, and I don't quite understand it. I'm not a real estate lawyer or municipal politician, but somehow they were able to use the bylaws and the law to their advantage. And I think cities, that's what they have to do. They have to really be creative, and with the help of experts and the community.
Okay, that leads me to my last question, because I'll start with you, Francis, because you have two daughters. So housing has been in the headlines it seems like every week. How do you see this housing issue evolving in the next 20, 30 years for your daughters, for example? What will they be living through? What do you think?
I think, it's an interesting question. I've thought about this over the years. I think, and I think COVID somehow has an influence here, because, in some way we're learning to live with less, in a sense, just maybe we're going to be moving towards smaller units, townhouses and so on, and that we'll be satisfied with that. We're just going to be so happy that we have a safe space and so on. And I think also, as the population ages, it's going to be demanding or looking for that kind of housing. And there could be a shift going on with maybe the younger generations, where their goal is not to have as big a home with as much land. It's to live in a community, in a comfortable space, surrounded by services and cultural opportunities. So less and less, I think, people really want to drive downtown. And now I've heard many young people don't have cars, don't aspire to having a car. And to be honest with you, the roads are pretty, it's a pretty, I don't want to say dangerous place, but it's not like it was 50 years ago going through
expensive.
It's expensive, but also it's a challenge negotiating those roads, and now with all kinds of other vehicles on the road. And so I think a lot of people are saying, well, I don't need to drive downtown. We'll have the REM now. We can take good public transit, and so we don't need the car. Maybe we don't need as much parking space. Also, one thing that we're going to have to look at, and there's a discussion. The Environment Committee of the House of Commons is looking at zero emission vehicles right now, and one of the issues is it's not just the recharging network across the country. It's how do you rewire houses such that you can plug in ZEVs? You know, it's great in a new development, you can plan for it, but how are we going to do it in the city and in older buildings? So I think that's going to be an issue going forward.
Especially when you put bike paths in front of the charging stations.
Exactly. Then okay, Ben, what? Hey, Ben,
I have
what?
to say it.
I'm not
what do you
sure
think
what
is
you're
going to be?
referring to, but to be honest,
Yeah. Ben, what do you think? 20, 30 years? How are we going to do affordable housing?
I think with the proper bylaws, I think that with governmental willingness, in the next 10 years, if the money is well spent, maybe we'll be able to achieve, to renovate what we already have. And I want to say that social housing is also it's part of everything. It's part of a global economy. I mean, the pandemic has been hard on our youth. The future of our youth, you're talking 30 years. Let's talk about how much money is being spent right now at the provincial and federal level for good reasons, for important programs, for all of that. But let's be honest that a lot of money is being spent, and how long are we going to pay for this interest of all this borrowing of this massive money? And I think that social housing has to become part of the DNA of any municipalities. I think that it should definitely be part of any type of development. Whenever, and I was criticizing the inclusivity bylaw presented by the Plante administration, but I think it's a stepping stone towards something. I think that we're in a direction, in an orientation that has been started with the ability for Montreal to have Accès Logis Montréal, and then slowly we'll be able to go towards maybe it'll be a federal law, maybe it'll be a provincial law, but at the same time, I think that every programs usually starts from the municipalities, and then other levels of government are like, oh yeah, let's improve this aspect of what was presented at the municipal level. I hear sometimes interventions I do at City Hall, they end up being a proposition, a declaration at the National Assembly. So I think that there is sort of everybody's listening to each other. And I think that in my case and in my party, I think that it's evident that it is a priority. It's a priority for the Plante administration as well. So I wouldn't see in the near future why that priority would change or would not be a priority. So in that sense, I think it's very positive, and that we're going to go towards what hasn't been done. Like my colleague Francis was saying, is that there was a lot of years where, when Heritage Canada program stopped with, the Conservative, for instance, I mean, obviously it had an impact in development for all these years. And now we have a deficit to make our Montreal upgraded, updated, and not have as many units not being used as we speak right now. And maybe build more new units with bylaws in collaboration with the private sector.
Okay, Simon, I'm gonna ask last one is you. Born and raised in West Islander, where do you see in 20, 30 years?
Well, I think we can't ignore the environmental crisis. I think that's going to change the way we live, evidently, in terms of, I think, density. I think the West Island is going to have to face the density. How are we going to approach this density? Right now, we're kind of focusing on only a few parcels, huge kind of tall buildings, high rises. What are we going to do with the single family houses? I saw in the comments also NIMBYism. I think that's going to be a huge issue in the future in the West Island. How do we, have a shared vision as a community of housing and how our neighborhood looks like? I think I share also the same comments about the shift of mentalities. of cars, the size of units as well. The home ownership, I think home ownership will probably be less popular for two reasons. Well, it's going to be a tougher market. It's probably going to be more like Toronto and Vancouver. That's where we're headed. And also, yeah, we're going to have to learn to live with less, and this idea of a consciousness of the environmental crisis. And I'm just going to finish with this, since, as you mentioned, I am from the West Island. I think fundamentally for me, the West Island historically has always been a place for the middle class. As we've seen post World War II, it was a home for cheap housing for veterans, for families. And I think where we're heading right now without the right actions, and I think these actions will happen. I'm not trying to be pessimistic, but I think the vision of where we're heading, if not actions are not taken, is we're going to see more like of a Westmount vibe, where rich people live in the West Island, live in single family houses, and there's no space for the middle class. We've seen all my friends, I'm young, are going to Vaudreuil, Laval, South Shore, getting further away from their communities, their family members that still live in the West Island. And I can truly state that I will not be buying or living in the West Island because I can't afford it. So that's the reality.
Don't tell your parents that.
Yeah. Don't want to make them cry or anything. But
Okay,
yeah,
well,
maybe I'll come back in a few years when I have the money. But right now, it kind of sucks that there's no options for this new generation. And the West Island has been affordable for over 60, 70 years. So just something to think about. It's my last thought.
All right. Well, thank you guys. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for the great discussion. We've now reached our Q&A portion of the webinar. So let's see what kind of questions the attendees have us for today. Alex, what do you see?
Okay, so I'd just like to remind everyone to type any questions that they might have in the chat. We have quite an active chat right now. But just to remind everyone, you can do so by clicking the chat button that appears at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to be reading the questions out loud. You also have the option to click the raise hand button, and Piotr will be looking for those raised hands, and he can then give you the option to ask your question out loud. So starting from the top, we have a comment/question. One of the factors that I see concerning affordability is that affordable districts in the West Island are targeted by developers who are purchasing reasonably priced lots, tearing down perfectly good homes, and putting up multi-million-dollar homes, changing the face of our municipalities. How can one stop this and keep the post-World War II veterans' cottages and bungalows in the hands of people who need homes, as opposed to developers who want to make money? Are citizens so completely helpless in front of the private sector to do whatever they want to do?
That's a tough question.
Do any of our panelists, have any reactions or answers to this question?
Well, you know, my understanding is that every community, every municipality has a, I don't know if you want to call it an urban planning committee or a demolition committee. And so, you know, those I would think is where those decisions are being made. You know, they have to deliberate on what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. Sometimes they're up against the property holder rights, you know, which are never absolute, but it is sometimes a legal matter. I think that's where the play is really. It's in the municipalities and within those committees. And you know, and it's, I guess, in some ways a case by case. There's many factors that would play into the decisions, I would imagine, of those committees, those planning and demolition committees.
Benoit, what do you think?
Well, I think that I want to remove a bit of the pressure that Francis just put on the CCU of municipalities. Le Comité consultatif d'urbanisme a pour mandat, has for mandate to really concentrate on specifics of a project. At the end of the day, it's really a question of laws, urbanistic laws, which allows you to, you know, have a driveway this wide, over this wide, in that corner, in that type of land, and so when it comes to it's part of a plan. It's part of the urbanistic plan that is partially imposed by Montreal through the CMM, and partially in the plan of a city, the city of Kirkland, which, for example, or Dorval, or they are part of a larger plan when it comes to urban development. Now, if citizens are starting to be vocal about the fact that a lot of the housing from the Second World War is being replaced by larger units and mega investments that are modern and 5 times the price. I mean, the unit needs to be renovated, but it also needs to respect the environment it's in. So sometimes I think that when these project arrives, they're going through a consultation process, and there is initiatives such as you can still vote against these projects by doing a referendum. It's still, I know, like 2 years ago it was almost removed, but that referendum is especially is the voice of the citizens that does a petition saying, well, we don't want this project when the consultation arrives. We don't want this project, and we want it to go through a referendum process. And if the referendum says, well, no, you can't build this massive house, well, the project won't happen. But again, it means citizen involvement. It means signatures. It could mean up to 150, depending on the size of the project. But there is that route for citizens to control the urban planning of their territory, in a sense.
Thank you, Benoit. That's a good one.
So another question that we have is, when I ask my municipal council why they aren't demanding that developers include a 15 or 20% of the units to be affordable before approving their project, I get told they don't have that power. And yet I have heard the Montreal Council demand that and have consequences if their demand is not respected. My daughter's an architect in London, UK, and the firm she works for has worked on many large housing projects that had at least 20% affordable, another percentage for handicapped, and high standards for ecological targets too. Why can't we get those kinds of demands made here? I'm assuming this person is speaking of the West Island specifically.
That's true. There has been aspects where the city thinks it's powerless. Simon, do you think, working in the public sector, private sector, now Groupe CDH, do you think that that's true?
Yeah, I think it's just a lack of political will for certain administrations. Unfortunately, I think there's still the thought that this bylaw, these types of bylaws will prohibit development. So a lot of
economic development.
Yeah, so I think some of that might be funded if these bylaws are completely extreme, but I don't think that they can, prohibit development if they're well written and whatnot. But I think it's also something that's just new. So a lot of these councillors, I think, are not aware that you can actually use the law in this manner. And in terms of saying like it's completely new, like the Montreal bylaw is probably going to be one of like the most progressive bylaws and most like intense bylaws in terms of what it demands, like in the world. It's going to be one of the most stricter regulation. So all of this is very new. So I think there's a need for us, for the community, to educate our councillors as well, to have these conversations in a respectful manner, and to show them that are other solutions. And I think in the next 2 or 3 years, every municipality will have to adopt some sort of regulation that will mirror the one that Montreal has adopted. It's probably going to be not as strict than Montreal, because there is this idea, I think, in the West Island politically that it might prohibit growth. But I think we're going to get there somewhere. And I see in the comment section, Dorval is thinking about it. Point Claire is thinking about it, I know, for certain sites, specific sites, Saint-Anne-de-Bellevue also. So we're heading in that direction, but it's our responsibility to really push that forward within council meetings and to try to educate not only councillors, but also the community.
Benoit, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I think that yes, municipal governments can arrive with bylaws, and they can propose bylaws that make sense for them and that are part of the larger urbanistic planning of the CMM. Now, to go back to what my colleague was saying, inclusivity ruling was there before what was just announced. It's just that now it's just more progressive and more aggressive. Aggressive in the sense that it does not listen to the housing market representatives. It doesn't include the lobbies of the immobilier world of the city. And I think that's a mistake, to be honest, because they know that they can make profit out of building social housing. And I think this bylaw is a bit too aggressive for getting everybody to work together towards more social housing. I think that it is important to have a bylaw in your city, but it has to be cautious about competitivity. We're talking about the housing market at large when we're talking about social housing. And so when you think that some of the municipalities are afraid to have those bylaws, or it's a bit because it's not true that cities and boroughs aren't competing with each other. At the end of the day, tax foncière, I mean, the money to pay service comes from the new developments, and its revenue comes from it. So to be as aggressive as this, I think is a mistake. And I think that it's a step in the right direction, but I think it needs to bring all the stakeholders together, which it's not right now.
I'd just like to add that the CMHC's rental construction financing program is built for what we're talking about, you know, where you get zoning in place, the permits are in place, you know, some of the units are more affordable, the project's energy efficient, you know, so they're building now programs around this vision, and I think that's a good thing.
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen.
So we have another question that goes back to something we discussed a little earlier on. The question is, why can't the West Island take advantage of the Rapid Housing Initiative? This is something I think that you mentioned, Simon. Do you think you could tell us a little bit more about why?
Yeah, it's a program. You need to have all of the projects submitted before December 31st. And that's not for the 56 million for the city. The 56 million for the city funding is already gone. We've already submitted our projects. And then there's another envelope, 500 million, that's available for all of Canada, that we can still do projects, submit projects for December 31st. The problem is that it's kind of funny because like we were saying, like Benoit was saying, usually it's like so long to get these projects done. And then this program, it's a reaction to the pandemic. So we want to get units out there. So it's so quick. But since it's so quick, it has its own challenges. For example, the number one challenge is that the zoning, meaning like the height, the density, everything, the use needs to be clean. So it needs to be ready to build. And this in the West Island is almost impossible to find. So that has not, like, it's not only the West Island, just most suburban communities are just like knocked out automatically. And also there's this affordability factor where a lot of the clientele, like for example, homelessness and everything, it's very hard to find the right financial setup to provide the services that these people need, not only the housing. And this program doesn't focus on services, which I understand why. So it's just one of these programs that's super quick, that's a bit like too quick for certain communities and certain clienteles. That would be like my short answer.
It's pretty good.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
We covered it all.
Okay, thank you. another comment here. At the municipal level, there's a lot of pushback from citizens, NIMBYism. The developers want to get their investment back. There is a minimum construction they can do to satisfy the citizens' NIMBY mentality. Also, if a project was to go with government funding at whatever level, there needs to be a team, mostly volunteers, to manage the project. People willing to take on this responsibility are non-existent. Do we have any reactions from our panelists? I think we're touching on NIMBYism here and then project management. Yeah, go ahead, Benoit.
Well, in 2008, I realized my community didn't have a shelter for homeless people. It took 10 years. In 2018, we got a letter for Ricochet. And then I joined politics, and then I switched, but I realized that the programs are often created for communities that are already ready to exploit and to do the expenses for these types of programs to happen. And so that's why there's something underlying most of these housing projects that is required, which is social development. If a city does not invest in a social development strategy, and social development is about justice sociale, and it needs to take in consideration the differences in the demographics, the economical demographic they have in their community, in order to plan for the next 10 years ahead, to make sure that these types of funding, like rapid housing, how come the West Island can't have access to this type of funding? Well, because its social development isn't developed enough to be able to have groups, housing groups. There is not even a group to defend the right of our renters in the West Island. You have to go to Saint Laurent. So there's a lot of services that are required to acknowledge, to identify, to define, to do the research, to present to decision makers what is required, what is needed, and what is scientifically demonstrated as a need at the political level. I don't think it's a will or an unwill to develop more social housing. I think that it's a system that is built for certain communities, and sometimes I find that programs needs to have a better understanding of the reality of other communities to be able to have access to those funding. I've always said that the West Island has one community organization for 1,000 residents, and that everywhere else there's one for 5,000. But you need those people in order to be able, these warriors, to express the voice of the ones that don't have a voice. Elderly programs, soutien à domicile communautaire. There's so many resources that are lacking that would bring these projects forwards, and that would have the capacity, because we're talking about organizational capacity. It takes about 5 years for a program like Ricochet to see the day. So, and we're talking 16 units. So, I mean, if what is needed is 300, there's a lot of work to be done before talking about social housing, in my perspective.
Yeah, I think I have to agree with. It's fascinating. When I work in other municipalities or boroughs, there's like this whole, I think it's more developed, this web of social organizations that Benoit is talking about. Like they have like for example, if it's like Kirkland, every month, all the community organizers would come together at the same table and would discuss specifically housing. We have that in every borough, everywhere else in Montreal, but I don't see it in the West Island. And I know there's committees here and there that are super important, but if we want to educate, fight NIMBYism, and educate just what is social housing and whatnot, we need these different organizations to start pushing our ideas forward. That's super important. And coming back to my other point, where we have no lots that are ready to be developed, that's a huge problem for NIMBYism, because I feel that in the context of the West Island, often we just don't adopt a huge plan, like a huge shared vision of what we want in certain neighborhoods. Rather, we just prefer treating every single project individually. So that creates like the opportunity for citizens to just re-question everything every time. And that's super hard for us and on our non-for-profits, because you can't just re-question everything every time. Can we just please once and for all agree on the height, on what type of quality the buildings you want to have, and then move forward with that vision? Because that's not what we have right now. And that's what adds to the timelines of these projects, why they take 2-3 years, because we have to often go back and forth in CCU and council, like for over a year, just discussing what we're going to build. And sometimes they're as small as 16 units, as Benoit said. It's so much work for not that many units. They're important, but it's a lot of work.
A collective vision. That's what you're describing, really.
Yeah.
So we have an interesting discussion in the chat. I'm going to try and summarize it a little bit, but essentially the discussion that's going on seems to revolve around new developments and how these new developments can take over forested areas or green spaces. And, you know, why do new developments go in this direction when there are either empty lots or other buildings that could be repurposed? So how do you find a balance between taking into consideration existing infrastructure and developing that towards affordable housing versus taking over green spaces and other areas that maybe should be protected?
Again, I guess it really comes down to the community's the choice of what kind of mix it wants. I mean, I think, you know, Benoit hit the nail on the head when he said, you know, when you really get down to it, it's about local grassroots democracy. It's what do citizens want, and how much effort, how much does it mean to them? Does it justify the effort that is required? And organizing at the community level when you, as a volunteer, is a big commitment. You know, there are examples in the West Island of volunteers coming together and affecting zoning and development. I mentioned Angel Woods, but also the Villa Beau Repair. That came out of a church group, you know, as far as I understand, and so they already had the kind of organizational structure, if you will. It wasn't, you know, an organizational structure dedicated to housing, but it was used to push a housing project, and that required obviously working with the municipality. So it depends on the community, and developers, yeah, they're going to, if they find a nice piece of land and they can make something nice out of it, sure, that they'll try and do that. But you know, they have to do that within the confines of bylaws. And you know, if you're a politician, you know, you've got a lot on your plate. You want, you know, you'll focus on what people come to see you about. And that's just the way, you know, that's even myself with issues at the federal level. You know, if I get a whole whack of mail on a particular issue, well, guess what? I'm going to start researching that issue to be able to respond as substantively as possible. And then I become a bit of a little expert on that issue. And when it comes up in a committee or in the House, I've got something to say. So it's the same at the municipal level. You need to engage the local leaders, councillors, and so on, and you know, they're open to being engaged. That's what their job is.
Yes, we are.
Anybody's open to being engaged.
Thank you, Fred. That's a good point.
So I think that that's it for today. It's most of the comments and questions in the chat. If there are any comments or questions that we weren't able to get to directly, please rest assured that we're taking all of these down and are keeping them, and we'll think about them going forward.